English from the café. Real conversations and useful phrases over coffee. Welcome to another immersive episode. Today, we step into the cozy, buzzing world of a café, where English flows naturally. Through real-life dialogue, subtle cultural tips, and powerful expressions, you'll experience how everyday English is spoken over coffee, cake, and connection. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind that made the streets glisten and people huddle under umbrellas. I ducked into a small neighborhood cafe, the kind with steamed-up windows, mismatched chairs, and the sweet scent of cinnamon and roasted coffee beans. Inside, the hum of quiet conversation and the soft clatter of cups created the perfect environment for a cozy break and a hidden opportunity to learn English. As I ordered a cappuccino, I overheard a woman at the next table chatting with her friend. "So, what have you been up to?" she asked casually. That simple phrase, "What have you been up to?" caught my attention. I had heard it before in textbooks, but here, it sounded so natural, effortless. Her friend responded, "Oh, just the usual work, errands, binge-watching shows. You know how it is." That short sentence was packed with real-life expressions. Just the usual, errands, and binge-watching. I smiled. This was the kind of English I wanted to learn. Sitting quietly, sipping my drink, I pulled out a small notebook. Not the kind you use in class, but a personal one, where I jotted down phrases that felt alive, human, and real. I wrote, "You know how it is," a phrase full of empathy, used when someone understands the rhythm and routine of another's life. This wasn't academic English. This was street-level fluency. The woman continued, "I'm actually thinking of taking a short trip to the coast. I need a break. City life's been a bit much lately." Another gem. A bit much. That phrase perfectly described feeling overwhelmed. I realized that every sip of coffee came with a lesson if I just listened closely. Meanwhile, behind the counter, the barista called out, "I've got a soy latte for Mike." His tone was friendly, casual. Mike approached the counter and smiled, replying, "Thanks a bunch." Not, "Thank you very much," or "Thank you," but "Thanks a bunch." It sounded warm, informal, and deeply native. I underlined it in my notebook. What struck me most was how much of real English lives in cafes. They are conversation theaters, social spaces where language is both background noise and the main act. Every detail, the way people ordered, the greetings, the small talk, even the laughter, was an English lesson hiding in plain sight. Across from me, another couple had just sat down. One of them asked, "Do you want to split a muffin?" And the other replied, "Sure, why not? I'm starving." Split a muffin, and I'm starving. Expressions of sharing and strong hunger, respectively, filled another page in my notebook. These were phrases not often taught in grammar books. Then came a new customer at the counter. She asked, "What do you recommend?" The barista responded, "If you're into chocolate, our mocha is a winner." There it was again, real, friendly English. If you're into, a smooth way to say if you like. And a winner. Not a person, but a great choice. These phrases were golden. At one point, someone spilled coffee on their shirt. His friend said, "Uh-oh, rookie mistake." They both laughed. Rookie mistake, a classic phrase to describe an error made due to inexperience. I loved how English could be humorous and understanding in such small moments. I noticed patterns in the rhythm and tone of their speech. People used contractions more often than full forms. I'm instead of I am, don't instead of do not. It sounded smoother, less robotic. It reminded me that fluency isn't just about vocabulary, it's also about flow. Outside, the rain picked up again, tapping softly on the windows. Inside, the café remained a world of warmth, stories, and language. A man nearby asked his friend, "You good?" Just 2 words, but a whole question packed into them. His friend replied, "Yeah, just zoned out for a sec." Zoned out, for a second. I couldn't believe how many ways English had to describe being mentally absent. It was beautiful. The barista took a break and joined a table. One of her coworkers said, "Busy day, huh?" And she replied, "Tell me about it." That was another expressive phrase, used not to ask for details, but to agree that the day had been tough. I circled it in my notebook. These small exchanges were golden. By now, I had 2 pages filled with expressions. But more than that, I had felt immersed in the music of real English. No rehearsals, no scripts, just natural speech in its most authentic form. This cafe wasn't just serving coffee, it was brewing fluency. I realized that listening wasn't enough. I had to practice, repeat, and eventually speak. So I ordered another drink and decided to join a conversation. Nervously, I said to the person next to me, "Crazy weather, right?" She smiled and nodded. "Totally." It's been pouring all week. My heart raced. I had made my first move, and it worked. This moment, this simple exchange, became the first of many. Over time, I returned to that cafe regularly. Each visit turned into a lesson, each cup of coffee a new chance to engage, learn, and speak. And slowly, my confidence grew. Every week, I found myself drawn back to the cafe, almost like a magnet pulling me in with its comforting familiarity and the promise of more authentic English. I started to notice how people interacted. Not just the words they used, but the tone, the facial expressions, and the pauses that added meaning beyond grammar. There was a man who always sat near the corner, tapping away on his laptop. One morning, I overheard him speaking on the phone, saying, "Let's circle back to this after lunch." Circle back. That meant to return to a previous point or topic. It sounded so professional, so naturally businesslike, yet relaxed. It was another beautiful expression I added to my growing list. Not long after, the barista, whose name I learned was Jasmine, asked a customer, "Still working on that?" as she motioned to the half-eaten croissant. Working on that wasn't about a project or assignment. It was about food. That one phrase was playful and warm, showing how flexible English can be. The customer laughed and said, "Yeah, it's a slow morning." Even the reply was rich with meaning. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the sunlight was spilling in through the windows, catching the gold glint of a spoon in a half-empty cup. A woman reading a book muttered, "I can't put this down." Another casual, powerful idiom. It didn't mean her hands were literally stuck. It meant the book was so good she didn't want to stop reading. I jotted that one down quickly. It dawned on me that this cafe was more than a place to buy a drink. It was an ecosystem of language, emotion, and subtle social codes. I started bringing flashcards, but instead of grammar rules, they held phrases I had heard that week. "No worries," "Catch you later," "Take your time," "What's the vibe today?" Each one was simple, but none had been taught in school. One afternoon, I decided to try speaking with the regulars. I greeted a middle-aged woman who often came in with her dog. "Hey there, mind if I sit here?" She smiled and gestured to the empty chair. "Not at all. Go ahead." That small success gave me a boost. We ended up chatting about her golden retriever. She said, "He's a handful, but I wouldn't trade him for the world." A handful, meaning difficult to manage. I made a note of it immediately. Later that day, I witnessed two friends meeting after what seemed like a long time. One of them exclaimed, "Long time no see," and the other replied, "Tell me about it. Life's been a roller coaster." Such simple lines, but so alive. Roller coaster didn't mean amusement park. It meant emotional ups and downs. I began to see how metaphors in English revealed culture and experience. There was also a rhythm to these conversations, a kind of melody to native speech. Phrases like, "Fair enough," "I'm down for that," "It's not my thing," and "Let's play it by ear" weren't just idioms. They were how people made plans, agreed, disagreed, and stayed flexible. They were the unspoken glue of real conversations. I paid more attention to intonation, too. When people said, "Seriously?" with raised eyebrows and a rising pitch, it meant surprise. When someone said, "Really?" with a flat tone, it meant disbelief or sarcasm. English wasn't just spoken, it was performed. Learning it was like learning music. The café staff had their own jargon, too. I heard one barista say, "We're 86 on oat milk." Curious, I Googled it later and found out that 86 meant they were out of something. It came from restaurant slang, and it was completely new to me. I realized again how rich and layered the language could be depending on the setting. Another time, a student at a nearby table was having a Zoom call and said, "Let me loop you in after I touch base with Sarah." Loop you in. Touch base. These weren't in the textbooks I had studied for years. They were the kind of phrases that make someone sound fluent, even native. I was learning that English wasn't a test. It was a lifestyle. The more I listened, the more I noticed patterns. People rarely spoke in full textbook-style sentences. Instead, they used sentence fragments, contractions, and sounds like mm-hmm, uh-huh, and you bet. These weren't just filler sounds. They conveyed agreement, hesitation, or understanding, depending on how they were used. One young guy ordered a drink and said, "Could I grab a cold brew to go?" Not, "Can I buy?" or "I'd like to have," but grab. It made everything sound casual, natural. The barista replied, "Sure thing. Coming right up." I smiled to myself. That entire exchange was just a few words, but full of native flavor. My own confidence began to grow. I started ordering my drinks with more clarity. I asked, "What's the difference between a flat white and a cappuccino?" and listened closely. The barista explained with ease, using words like foam, bold, and smooth. Vocabulary I didn't expect to learn that day became part of my story. I even found ways to correct my mistakes gently. Once I said, "I want one coffee," and the barista replied kindly, "A coffee, got it." She had subtly corrected me without making me feel embarrassed. That was the magic of conversation. Learning through real interaction. In one corner, a man was explaining something to a group of tourists. I heard him say, It's kind of our go-to spot. We've been coming here forever. Go-to spot meant a favorite place. Coming here forever didn't mean since the beginning of time. It meant for a long time. English was so rich in exaggeration and emotion, I began to appreciate the storytelling behind every phrase. Another regular brought her kid, who spilled some juice. The mother said, "It's okay, accidents happen." I felt touched by her gentle tone. Later, the kid tugged at her sleeve and said, "I'm bored." She replied, "Well, let's make a game out of waiting." Even small family talk was a lesson. By now, the staff and customers began to recognize me. One said, "You're the guy always scribbling in that notebook, right?" I laughed and nodded. "Yeah, that's me. I'm learning English. From this café." He smiled. "You've picked a great classroom." And he was right. Each visit to the café had become more than a routine. It was a ritual, a living classroom where every corner held new opportunities for learning. I started coming at different times of the day just to hear how the tone and topics of conversation changed. In the mornings, the place was filled with sleepy commuters, briefcases, and the scent of fresh espresso. Their language was brisk, efficient. I heard a woman say, "Let's touch base before noon," and a man reply, "I'll pencil it in." Pencil it in, meaning to make a tentative plan. It was precise, yet soft. I scribbled it down. Afternoons were slower, the pace more relaxed. Students gathered around laptops, freelancers typed on wireless keyboards, and friends caught up over lattes. I overheard a student say, "I totally spaced on the deadline," and her friend chuckled, "Happens to the best of us." To space on something was a new phrase for me. It meant to forget unintentionally. I found it fascinating how even mistakes were framed with empathy. Evenings were magical. The golden hour sunlight spilled through the glass, painting warm patterns across the wooden floor. The vibe changed. Couples whispered, people laughed more freely, and the music shifted to soft acoustic tunes. One guy walked in and greeted the barista. "The usual, please." And just like that, his drink was already being made. The usual meant he had a favorite order, and they remembered. It was about connection, familiarity. I began experimenting more. I intentionally joined conversations, asked for recommendations, made small talk. It wasn't always smooth. Once, I misused a phrase and said, "I will catch you later," to someone I had just met. He smiled politely and corrected me. "Catch you later is more for friends. You could just say, 'Nice meeting you.'" It was a moment of gentle correction, and I appreciated it deeply. Every misstep became a lesson. There was a woman I often saw sketching in a notebook. One day I gathered the courage to ask, "What are you drawing?" She replied, "Mostly scenes from around here, moments that feel alive." We chatted for 20 minutes about art and expression, and I picked up phrases like color, outside the lines, and rough sketch. English was not just about vocabulary, it was about feelings, imagination, human connection. My notebook filled with expressions I never imagined learning. No strings attached. Give me a heads up. That's a no-brainer. Don't sweat it, and let's play it by ear. I started to understand that idioms weren't just decorative, they were bridges between people. When you used the right phrase in the right moment, it showed more than skill. It showed belonging. One of my favorite discoveries was how questions were phrased. Instead of asking, "Can I help you?" Many baristas said, "What can I get started for you?" The phrase felt more action-oriented, more inviting. It taught me that service language in English was about tone as much as meaning. Politeness wasn't just please and thank you. It was the rhythm, the softness, the facial cues. I watched how people gave feedback. Instead of bluntly saying, "This is wrong," they'd say, "Have you thought about trying this instead?" Or, "What if we did it this way?" Even criticism was offered with gentleness. That nuance was never taught in classrooms, yet it was essential to fluency. One evening, I overheard a heated conversation. A man was clearly upset, but he kept his tone measured. He said, "I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus, but we need to address the issue." Throw under the bus was a metaphor meaning to blame someone unfairly. I realized how many emotions and social negotiations lived inside everyday expressions. There were also lovely moments of humor. A little boy dropped his cookie, and his dad said, "Well, that's the end of the world." Not. The child giggled, and I saw how sarcasm could lighten a moment. Language wasn't always logical. It was playful, poetic, and full of irony. These nuances made English feel alive. One rainy day, the café was nearly empty. I sat alone near the window, sipping my drink and listening to the soft hum of the espresso machine. A man walked in, soaked from head to toe, and said, "Well, I guess I forgot my umbrella dance today." The barista laughed. "That's one way to make an entrance." It wasn't about literal dancing. It was a joke, an idiom, a moment of human warmth. I found myself smiling for no reason. Soon, I was teaching myself how to use these phrases. I practiced aloud while walking home. I recorded myself and compared the rhythm. I even tried imitating accents, not to mimic, but to train my ears. English was becoming part of me. Not just a subject I studied, but a voice I was learning to embody. I learned to read between the lines. When someone said, "It's been a day," they weren't just talking about time. They were talking about stress, fatigue, emotion. When someone said, "I'm hanging in there," it didn't mean they were literally hanging. It meant they were surviving a hard time. These phrases held emotion, resilience, identity. One Saturday, the cafe hosted an open mic night. Poets, singers, and storytellers stood up and shared their work. A woman read a piece about coffee being more than a drink. It was a witness to breakups, job interviews, new friendships, and quiet mornings. She ended with the line, "Coffee doesn't judge." The room erupted in applause. I was moved. That night, I realized language was more than communication. It was expression, emotion, truth. The more I listened, the more I noticed what wasn't said. The pauses, the looks, the and you know, at the end of sentences. English had a rhythm, like jazz, with improvisation and pattern. I started to flow with it. I could predict where conversations were going. I could respond naturally. My fear of speaking faded into curiosity. On a whim, I asked the owner of the cafe, "Would it be okay if I started a conversation club here on Sundays?" She beamed. "I think that's a wonderful idea. Let's do it." And so, the next week, I printed out a sign. English Cafe Conversation Circle, all levels welcome. And to my surprise, people came. We sat around, talked about books, movies, travel, and language. People shared phrases from their countries, idioms they loved, cultural stories. I wasn't just learning English, I was sharing it. That was the real breakthrough. English had become not only something I practiced, but something I gave. By then, the cafe didn't feel foreign anymore. It felt like home. The baristas knew my name. The regulars waved when they saw me. My notebook was no longer filled with just words. It was filled with memories, moments, milestones. And the most beautiful part? I wasn't afraid to speak anymore. I had learned that making mistakes was part of the journey, and every interaction was a new chapter in my English story. The Sunday conversation circle quickly became a highlight of my week. At first, just 4 or 5 people showed up. But word spread. Friends brought friends. Passers-by saw our little sign and asked to join. Within a month, we had over 20 regulars, people from all walks of life, each with a story, a dream, and a desire to speak better English. Some were shy, others talkative, but we all shared one thing: courage. The courage to speak, to stumble, to learn. We didn't follow strict lessons. Instead, each week had a theme, like travel stories, funny mistakes, or dream jobs. I prepared a few key phrases and idioms related to the topic and handed out little cards. Then, we simply talked. We laughed. We listened. We learned. That cafe became more than a coffee shop. It became our classroom, our sanctuary, our stage. What amazed me most was how quickly people improved. Not because of grammar drills or pronunciation charts, but because they were engaged. They wanted to tell their stories. They wanted to connect. I saw how powerful it was when learning was joyful. One man who had barely spoken a word at the beginning was now cracking jokes in English. A woman who had been self-conscious about her accent now read poems aloud with pride. We encouraged each other, celebrated every small win, and turned awkward silences into teachable moments. Over time, I developed my own philosophy of language learning, inspired by what I saw in that cafe. First, immersion isn't just about being surrounded by the language. It's about being emotionally involved. When you care about what you're saying and who you're saying it to, learning sticks. Second, speaking early and often matters more than speaking perfectly. Fluency grows in real-time use, not silent practice. Third, English isn't just words, it's music. The rhythm, intonation, and flow matter as much as vocabulary. I even started helping others outside the cafe. I volunteered at a local library's English help desk, tutored children at a nearby school, and recorded voice notes to help friends understand tricky phrases. It felt amazing to give back, to share what I had struggled so hard to gain. My identity was shifting, from a learner to a leader, from a student to a speaker. I also kept a journal, not just for vocabulary, but for reflection. I wrote about things like, what does confidence feel like in English? Or, how did today's conversation make me feel? Language learning had become deeply personal. It was no longer about passing a test or impressing someone. It was about becoming someone new. And I learned to appreciate mistakes. One day, I meant to say, I'm feeling under the weather, but accidentally said, I'm under the cloud. People laughed kindly, and one person even said, that's kind of poetic. It was in those moments, those vulnerable human moments, that I bonded most deeply with others. Through it all, the cafe remained my grounding place. I came to know everyone, the elderly man who always sat by the window with his crossword puzzles, the teenage girl who doodled in the margins of her notebook. The barista who wore punny t-shirts that said things like, "Espresso yourself." They weren't just part of the scenery. They were part of my story. English became more than a tool. It became a mirror reflecting who I was becoming. Braver, more curious, more connected. I noticed how my voice changed. I no longer spoke with hesitation. I used expressions naturally. My mind stopped translating. Instead, it flowed in English. That, to me, was real fluency. Not perfection, but presence. The biggest shift happened when I stopped thinking of English as a second language and started thinking of it as another language I loved. It wasn't foreign anymore. It was familiar. It was mine. I remember one particular evening, close to the 1-year mark of my café journey. I sat at my usual spot, sipping tea, watching the sun dip behind the buildings. A woman at the next table dropped her phone, and I instinctively said, "You okay?" She smiled and said, "Thanks, all good." It was such a small exchange, but it felt significant, natural, effortless. That night I went home and looked through my old notebook, the one I had started on my first day. The pages were filled with clumsy scribbles, misunderstood idioms, and awkward translations. But now, I understood every single line. And more than that, I remembered the stories behind them. The people, the places, the moments. Each phrase wasn't just a word. It was a window into a time I dared to grow. In that moment, I wrote a final entry in bold letters. English is not something I study, it's something I live. That sentence felt like a victory. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a milestone worth celebrating. To anyone starting their own language journey, I say this: don't wait for the perfect lesson, the perfect accent, or the perfect moment. Start now. Start with curiosity. Start with people. Language is not about mastery, it's about connection, and the world is waiting to connect with you. So find your own café, whether it's a physical space, an online group, or just a quiet spot with your headphones and an English podcast. Fill your notebook. Speak your truth. And remember, every small step, every awkward sentence, every tiny habit, it all adds up. In the end, it's not about sounding like a native. It's about sounding like yourself, confidently, clearly, and fully, in English.